In this video I want to show you why an erupting volcano isn't necessarily a disaster. I'll explain a simple equation which shows what turns an event like that into a disaster, and ask why that equation shows that human choices are increasing the risk of disasters. When people ask me what makes a disaster, I say it's not just the occurrence of something like an earthquake or an erupting volcano. They tend to say, of course those are disasters, but I ask, suppose a volcano erupts and there's no one there. Is that a disaster? Then they pause and usually agree, no, it's not a disaster, because a disaster is something that impacts people. But suppose people live on the slopes of a volcano and it erupts and people are injured or even killed and their houses and farmlands destroyed. That's clearly a disaster. But then the question is, why are those people there on the slopes of an active volcano? Often the answer is because they have to. It's cheap land, the only land they can afford. You may have heard of the historic disaster of the eruption of Vesuvius, causing the destruction of Pompeii. It's portrayed as a terrible, unexpected and shocking event. You may have seen images of casts made of shapes in the volcanic ash. People instantly vaporised underneath the dust, captured in that moment of horror, hunching up or trying to escape, something that seems unavoidable. It's a disaster. But there are records of that disaster which tell us that there have been earthquakes and seismic events for weeks, months, even years before the eruption. People had plenty of warnings. The records show also that many of the wealthier people had actually left. The people who were left behind either had to because they couldn't afford to move, or somehow didn't have the information, or didn't understand. What's even scarier than that story is that if we wind the clock forward to the 21st century, a major hospital was recently built inside the volcanic risk zone of Vesuvius, the result of political wrangling about regional boundaries. When will we ever learn? A disaster is constructed. It's made by the combination of two things, and one thing is, yes, certainly the volcanic eruption. That's a hazard, but it's not a problem if no one's exposed to it. But the other thing is that exposure, people's vulnerability to the hazard. And the two things make, in disaster studies, a very simple equation that's been kicking around for more than 50 years. Vulnerability multiplied by hazard equals risk. That word risk is really important. I've mentioned in the previous video that wide evidence shows that human choices are leading to increased risk. For example, by building a hospital in the risk zone of Vesuvius. We've seen other examples too. The way that rapid development in Kampala leads to increased flooding in the poor areas, and how unmanaged development in Kathmandu allows building which will increase damage and injury when an earthquake strikes. These examples, along with many others, show that there are forces lying behind the degree of hazard and vulnerability. Human choices increase the level of hazards that people are exposed to. The flood hazard in Bweze and other poor areas of Kampala is increased by development in the city centre, and also on a larger scale by unmanaged carbon dioxide production, leading to global warming and in turn to heavier rains. Human choices also increase the level of vulnerability of people exposed to the risk of disasters. Poverty, for example, pushes people into more dangerous and fragile situations, such as city slums, or forces them to take actions that increase their own vulnerability. Why is this happening? Why do people choose to make hazards greater and to increase vulnerability? In the next video, we'll see how this can come about through finding out about a major disaster in Honduras and its prequel and sequel. If you found this video useful in understanding disasters, subscribe to this channel as we explore disaster makers, and check out the Disaster Makers book.